Hey, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're watching this. My name is Barbara Braun, and I'm with the Aerospace Corporation. And I'm going to talk a bit about the STP-2 mission, which was last year's Air Force Falcon Heavy launch. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors. They are Mike Marlowe of the Air Force, Dave Vocal, Art Menichello, and Sabrina Herron of the Aerospace Corporation. And first, I'm going to talk just a little bit about what the DoD Space Test Program is. So the DoD Space Test Program provides access to space for all of the DoD's experiments. But what we mean by a DoD experiment is rather broad. We launch not only payloads from military organizations and laboratories, but also universities, international partners, commercial entities, any spacecraft or experiment that has military relevance. All you need is a DoD sponsor to indicate the DoD's interest in your technology. We also happen to be the front door for any spacecraft that wants to fly as a rideshare on DoD launches and any DoD payload that wants to fly on the ISS or its resupply missions. In fact, we fly over 50% of our experiments on the ISS or to or from or even in the ISS. And we've been around for a very long time. We actually have over 50 years of experience, 280 missions, over 600 experiments on everything from sounding rockets to national security space launches to the space shuttle and to the ISS now. So in the course of its history, STP has done an awful lot of ride shares, from big missions to small missions. But last year we had the opportunity to launch a rideshare mission on one of STP's biggest rockets ever, the Falcon Heavy. So the STP-2 mission, which launched successfully on the 25th of June last year, carried 24 satellites from 13 organizations to 3 different orbits on the first DoD use of the Falcon Heavy. So I'm here to tell you a little about what we learned from this massive effort. It wasn't quite herding kittens, but at least it was a lot of organizing of cats of various different agencies with different backgrounds, experience levels, and goals. And first, I kind of want to give you an overview of all the payloads on the missions. We had 2 co-prime missions. One was the Demonstration and Science Experiment, also called DSX, from AFRL. It conducted space weather characterization and experimentation in the MEO orbit regime. We also had 6 cosmic satellites built by the National Space Organization of Taiwan. They carried terrestrial weather monitoring payloads, including a couple provided by the Space and Missile Systems Center. In addition to these co-primes, we had 5 auxiliary payloads, sometimes called APLs. These included NASA's Green Propellant and Fusion mission, which in addition to carrying new green propellant and thrusters, also hosted 3 STP payloads. We had the Orbital Test Bench satellite from General Atomics, a commercial satellite that actually carried an atomic clock for NASA and 2 experiments. And then we had 2 satellites from the AFRL's University Nanosatellite program. They're called Prox and Oculus, and they were in partnerships with Georgia Tech and the Michigan Technological University, respectively. And finally, we had NPSat-1, a satellite from the Naval Postgraduate School. In addition to these co-primes and the APLs, we also had 12 CubeSats from all the agencies you can see here. Of interest to Bill Nye fans, STP-2 carried the Planetary Society's LightSail 2 CubeSat as part of the Prox satellite. LightSail 2 actually was deployed by Prox after its separation from STP-2. And on the right, you can kind of see a diagram over here of the stack. On top is the DSX satellite with the ESPA ring as its primary structure. Underneath, you have the 2 big ESPA Grande-like rings. Those hosted the 6 cosmic spacecraft, and actually in the end, and in a little bit we'll talk about the changes in adaptability that this mission required, the CubeSats, which were originally supposed to be deployed from the payload attachment fitting, which is kind of below this stack image that you see here, were moved up to these empty ports on these these cosmic ESPA rings. That both improved the processing flow at the Cape, and it also helped the CubeSats launch vibration environments a lot. Finally, on the bottom, we have the auxiliary payload ring. These are the ESPA class auxiliary payloads, 5 of them on this ring around the bottom. And then as another example of something that we had to kind of change at the end, we originally started with 6 auxiliary payloads. One of them, Falcon Sat 6, had an opportunity for a much better launch much earlier than, or not much earlier, but at least 9 months earlier than we could have gotten them off. And about 9 months prior to launch, they were removed and remanifested tested on a different rocket. So it kind of shows how this mission came together and the adaptability required of all the partners over time. I also want you to notice all the different organizations involved, from high schools to universities to government entities to commercial entities to the government of Taiwan. This is primarily one of the things that will recur throughout this mission, all the different intercooperation required among these different diverse agencies. So the overall goals of the mission are listed here in order. The first goal was really for the Air Force to just use the Falcon Heavy and to learn how to work with this new launch vehicle that had the potential to supply a chunk of the Air Force's national security space launch needs. Second and third, pretty much co-equal, were to launch the co-prime missions, DSX and Cosmic. Next in priority was to launch the auxiliary payloads, and finally to launch the CubeSats. And for missions of this size and complexity, we really feel it's imperative for mission managers to understand not only the goals of their missions, but also their relative importance in order. In fact, this is true. We find this to be true for missions of any size and not just launch missions. Having well-documented, well-articulated, prioritized goals helps the team make smart decisions in trades, especially during crunch time. Now, to choose all of these missions, STP first offers rides to the satellites from our Space Experiment Review Board, or SERB list, and also any outside satellites willing to host SERB experiments. Like STP missions, many STP missions, we also had to accommodate the desires of the Air Force, our parent organization. In this case, the desire to fly the cosmic satellites, and also the desire to demonstrate the use of the Falcon Heavy, of course. We then offer rides to reimbursable payloads that fund STP to provide launch and rideshare services. Since the co-prime missions took priority, though, all auxiliary payloads and CubeSats had to be accommodated as part of the planned mission profile. That means they had to be compatible and willing to go to the insertion orbit or one of the two main orbits intended for Cosmic or DSX. In other words, auxiliary payloads were absolutely not allowed to engage in interstage dogfighting and or to take over after a struggle with the prime. I'm also happy to report we had no encounters with Care Bears during the launch and ascent profile. To accommodate all these missions, we set up the program office with representatives for each of the missions. In some cases, especially for the CubeSats and the smaller missions, one Air Force or one aerospace person would be the prime point of contact for multiple missions. But each mission had an Air Force counterpart, and this helped with communication flow across the team, including during the development of interface control documents. And as we've talked, one of the recurring considerations of STP2 was the need to handle change and uncertainty, and the ICDs were no exception. Since the Falcon Heavy had never flown before, there was almost no information available about the vibration environment, and yet the payload team still needed to plan for testing. So the teams were directed to use the General Environmental Verification Specifications, or the GEVs, until the final predicted environments were available. This resulted in some after-the-fact pencil sharpening and analysis, but this is just one example of many cases where the ICDs moved forward with known TBDs and in order to keep the program on track, and so that we could come back and revisit those once further information was available. And as we always discussed, later in the flow, we responded to change. We moved the CubeSats from the payload attachment fairing to the spare ports on the Espa Grandes, and we also moved FalconSat 6 off of the STP2 mission and on to a different mission. Overall, this willingness to respond and adapt to change was critical in keeping this mission a success. Also critical were good working relationships, flexibility, and the willingness to adapt in order to maintain those good working relationships. This was especially true because there really was no formal contractual agreements binding spacecraft mission teams to each other. And even agreements with STP were mainly accomplished through memoranda of agreement. We found that those MOAs emphasized what would be accomplished by the mission and why the mission was mutually beneficial to both parties. And if these two items remained constant, most of the rest of the agreement could be modified as needed to adjust to any changes. Because the Falcon Heavy had such a long development cycle, there were a lot of schedule slips. And these were handled differently among the different agencies involved. Government agencies could generally accommodate a schedule slip by reassigning personnel, but this was harder on commercial entities. And in universities, a lot of times they essentially would graduate their workforce, and at times we had 100% turnover during the course of the mission. These are just one example of how the different types of organizations on the mission all had kind of different practice differences that had to be accommodated. The Overall, though, the schedule slips and the turnover of personnel really highlighted the need for good knowledge transfer and enough documentation to ensure that early decisions, especially those made verbally during face-to-face meetings, weren't lost when the individuals involved moved on. We strongly recommend all missions like this, and all missions really, have thorough meeting minutes for all major discussions and even for some of the minor ones. Occasionally, issues would be revisited over and over again and even linger for years because the resolution was either never documented or never assigned as a formal action item to move on. We also recommend keeping these documentation on a shared site that's accessible to everyone. Finding such a sharing mechanism can be difficult, especially among all these different types of agencies. But we were able to do it, and that really keeps everybody on the same page. Finally, and most critically, open communication is really key. There's a tendency in complex missions to insist that communication flow up the hierarchical chain and then back down again. This ensures that leadership is kept in the loop, but it really does slow things down. We really recommend allowing engineers to talk directly to each other amongst the missions while keeping leadership in the loop and notifying them of any changes, rather than making leadership the single point of failure on all discussions. I won't spend a lot of time on policy, partly because it's boring and partly because we also gave a paper several years ago at the 2016 Small Satellite Conference that talked about all we learned about the policy roadmap from handling all these different types of satellites from all the different agencies. Nor am I going to talk extensively about the do no harm rideshare process because that was the topic of a 2015 Small Satellite Conference paper, which you can look up. But what I do want to emphasize was how on STP2 we broke down policy compliance like this. Each mission, that is each separating spacecraft, was responsible for its own policy compliance. So the NASA missions went through the NASA process, not the DoD process. Universities and commercial missions followed their processes. The cosmic satellites adhered to the regulation of the government of Taiwan and so forth. The STP2 Mission Management Office required agencies to sign a certification letter, which documented not only their policy compliance, but also their readiness for flight and their adherence to do no harm criteria. This doesn't mean that we didn't verify. We did employ trust but verify. We actually had about 800 items on our do no harm checklist, including not only spacecraft testing artifacts, but also artifacts related to policy compliance. And we checked the status of all those items regularly. Prior to launch, we also presented them to the Space and Missile Systems Center commander as part of his launch readiness evaluation. And of course, we provided a lot of analysis, guidance, and help to the mission partners, especially those less experienced in navigating the policy quagmire. And finally, before we get to launch, I wanted to briefly mention the benefit of fit checks to the process of rideshare launch integration. STP2, like a lot of STP missions, conducted a full fit check of its entire integrated payload stack. In the unair-conditioned Launchpad 39A processing high bay, which was filled with mosquitoes. But each satellite provided a volumetrically similar model for the fit check. Some were very high fidelity, very exact engineering models, and some were constructed out of cardboard and glue. But the main point was to check the fit and installation and also the processing and the movement of all the people with all of these satellites arriving at the same time to the payload processing facility and the sequence of their events. Overall, we discovered issues with antennas, primarily when people walked into them. We discovered the need for more pallet checks. We, in the end, documented over about 100 lessons learned, which helped the team make the actual flight integration go more smoothly. And this is one of the big lessons learned of a lot of STP missions. We find fit checks invaluable for rehearsing one of the most high stress and high cost parts of the processing chain when you're actually all at the launch site together. So finally, after all the mission manifesting and ICD development, all the schedule slips and all the stack modifications, the do no harm verifications, the fit checks, all of this culminated in a spectacular liftoff of the Falcon Heavy from Launchpad 39A at Cape Canaveral. All payloads were successfully deployed and successfully contacted. We even got to see the successful return of the 2 side boosters and the slightly less than successful but spectacular return of the center core. Still is 100% fully successful launch for our goals, and we really could not have done it without the efforts I've described here. Teamwork, good communication, flexibility and understanding, cardboard and glue, and a lot of hard work by all the organizations involved. and also enthusiasm. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, you can always contact any of the authors by looking at the contact information on the paper.